Hello, everyone, and welcome to my final presentation for LAI 525. It'll be concerning the internet and social media and applications towards digital literacy and scientific literacy. With me is PhD candidate Devra Hock
Hello.
and Dr. Melina Litchi.
Hi.
So, I guess if you guys want to give a little bit of your background on what you guys do and how it pertains to science communication, education, and outreach.
Sure. So I'll start. So I'm doing my PhD in mammalian paleontology, and I'm focusing on interpreting past environments from trait distributions. And I also have a lot of interest in museum work and building museum exhibits. And I've worked with informal education and science communication via museums and via summer camps from just other informal places and institutions. So that's basically where I come from, is an informal side of things, and doing science communication that way.
Melina?
Okay, I guess it's my turn. So I am Dr. Melina Litchi, and my background is in actually lake research. So I started out in geology, started out doing paleontology actually, working with dinosaurs, and then I started studying tiny little algal creatures called diatoms. My main focus so far has been using my skills to teach and teach students how to do research. So right now I am an instructor in geology at University of Nebraska, Omaha. So I do science communication by teaching, but I also have done some bar talks and other podcasts, and I'm really passionate about connecting with the public and figuring out how to get science out there and talk to people in a more productive way.
So I guess where we would start with is kind of going over, digital literacy and scientific literacy, which are both covered in my paper. But basically, roughly, weirdly enough, both of them don't have a clear defining element, at least for digital literacy, other than it's a comprehension and understanding of social media components. It started off more as just an ability to interface well with digital technology on a web-based kind of setting. But I guess my first question is, what do you guys consider digital literacy, since you both interact with education on a digital format? Both of you had had to teach from home, either completely during the pandemic or at different parts, and also have done it as kind of a remote learning and in person.
I guess for me, a definition of digital literacy would being able to discern authoritative and biased sources on the internet, and not only sources but people and personalities, and being able to make informed opinions by being taught how to do that. So like when we were all in middle school, it was like, oh, you can't use Wikipedia because that's not an authoritative source. Like, it's edited by normal people. And so that was basically the extent of what I was taught of how to discern things on the internet. And that, like, when Google Scholar came up, it was like, okay, this is where you find like the actual science papers, not the popular science articles that Google itself produces. So I think there's definitely stuff to be done there. But yeah, that would be my idea and definition of it, as I've worked informally with virtual stuff, is really just being able to discern, like, if something's supporting your idea, if something's blatantly against your idea, if someone has the authority to speak on it or to write on it, and being able to parse that out for yourself.
Yeah, and I actually agree with that definition. So I have an example of my experience with this recently. I've been doing these blog post assignments with two of my classes this semester. And in the blog post assignments, part of it is you have to find sources, you have to refine your writing, you're trying to communicate what we're learning in class in a way that's relatable to the public. So basically what I'm trying to have my students do is take what they're learning, present it in a public forum way that's actually friendly and readable, but also using real sources. And in this experience, I have found that most students coming into university do not have a very good understanding of what a primary source is versus secondary source. So, for example, I've had students taking articles, like Devra just said, and presenting them as if that article, the author of that article, did the research itself. So they're citing that author for the research. And basically, that's just a disconnect between, oh, there's another person doing this research, and they're just reporting on this research, and they don't know how to find those papers. And a part I'd like to add on to this is it's partially not their fault. Some of these papers are just not very publicly accessible. So I have to actually point these things out, and then they're like, oh, I can follow this, and I can find this for myself. But it's been a kind of weird process to watch because as somebody now so far along in my research career, it seems so second nature to just go, okay, Google Scholar is where I'm going to look, or the databases at my university. But students don't have access to those things always, and that's part of the problem, a big part of the problem.
Or even worse, you have the general public themselves that maybe they can use Google Scholar, but then everything else is behind a paywall. Even the stuff on Google Scholar.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
paywalls.
Like I taught a virtual paleontology class through a museum this summer, and part of what their kind of final project was doing a debate on a topic, so they each had to look up scientific papers and find the ones that supported that side of that hypothesis and argue on it. And these were high schoolers, and it was definitely they were emailing me like a lot of papers that like they just couldn't get at. Like accessibility is a big thing, but it's also like Melissa just like showing them how to find those papers. And once you break down how to search for and how to read a scientific paper, it's not as daunting as I think a lot of people think it is. Like, yes, there's jargon in the papers themselves, but you can always use a dictionary or find out what that word means. But being able to discern, like, what are my search terms? Like, how do I tell if the paper even covers what I'm searching for? Like, you know, like probably like 20 to 30% of what I search, like I actually find 20 to 30% of papers that like I think will work, and then I narrow it down from there of ones that I actually end up using. And it's just like teaching that process to upper level high schoolers, I think, was really valuable for them, even if they don't go directly into a science field.
Yeah, and to kind of go off of that, another part of online digital literacy is knowing that you have access to a whole bunch of information, and some students don't realize how much information they have access. You might not know a word and then shut down because you don't understand that jargon, but there's dictionary.com, there's a whole bunch of other things, and you can self-learn. You just have to explore instead of having somebody online tell you the information.
Yeah, and that's a concern, and that actually leans into a couple of the themes that we have for this, you know. Scientific literacy, I don't think we need to define nearly as much. That's basically being able to ascertain information that is credible to a specific subject matter or interest of somebody's. But just for the sake of it, because it's in the paper, I'm including it. All right, moving on. So when we get to the things that I've noticed while I was writing this paper, and I pulled from some other research I've experienced, whether it was dealing with anti-vax and pseudoscience, one of the big things I've discovered is it's hard for people online to really identify an authoritative voice that is also credible, because there are now tons of research out there that shows that trust in traditional media as well as on social media is through the floor. I think that's because we don't really have any standards for being able to identify what's a legitimized source and what is just someone's opinion. And we've kind of seen that kind of obfuscated because of political television and ideologies. And instead of having facts presented and then an opinion off of those facts, it's facts first, or opinions first, facts second, or third. And I guess one of those things is trying to help those kids learn kids or adults or teachers in general learning how to apply a discernible eye at that material. One of the papers I covered that covered social media pedagogy kind of ideas and experiments found that a lot of kids failed. Basically, one of their tests was they sent them to a website, I believe it was called, hold on, I got the paper here. It's CO2science.com. And the point of them including this was or .org, I believe, I apologize. It basically was they actually say in their abstract basically to disseminate facts and express opinions. And they were funded by, I believe, ExxonMobil and all this stuff that was right there on the page. Or even if you went offline and looked up that website, they'd immediately be brought up to that. And I think they said 92% scored what was called beginner, which basically means they failed any discernible abilities. They basically treated it, because it was a .org, as an authoritative source. It didn't look at its funding sources. It didn't look at kind of what's influencing it. It just had a forward-facing presentation of authoritative sourcing, but they didn't follow up on anything. And only, I think, 8%, 8.6%, I think was the actual number, were able to do basically what's called lateral reading, which is they go from that webpage and then they open up other tabs and start examining those pages to kind of discern it. And I've noticed I've started doing that a lot more, especially when it comes to COVID, my own personal spite towards PragerU. I will never not hide my dislike for that group of people, because they use ideology and fanaticism as a factoid instead of the actual evidence. And if you ever watch any of their videos, it's hair ripping out and just frustrating. But it's one of those things where I kind of wonder how we can discern that, because the way they have a nice budget, they're very well edited, presented, they have great sound mixing, they look like a professional group that would rival a PBS, but their formatting in terms of how they present content is influenced by political ideology and leanings, while as PBS tries to give an objective approach to things.
Well, I think it's teaching what to look for. So, like you said in that one paper, they didn't know to think about that, this is being sponsored by ExxonMobil. What does that mean? They don't know to look for that. I think so. Teaching those kind of steps, as simple as it sounds, doing an activity even in middle school and especially in high school as part of the research gathering process of okay, you're in a English class or you're in a science class, you have to write a paper about something. All right, before you guys get started, we're going to do this exercise, use that website or another one, and you could essentially build a lesson plan around identifying funding sources, identifying who's in charge or CEOs or something like that, and basically teach that in almost a flowchart style pathway. And I think it is as you just need to teach them how to do, and it's probably not going to just be one time. It's probably going to be every class they do a literature research paper. They get taught this at various levels of depth. But when I was student TAing my undergraduate honors text and critics class at Montana State, which is essentially the English Writ 101 class for the honors students, for the honors college. And I had a couple of students that were very religious, very evangelical, creationist. And there was one paper that it was after our segment on philosophy. So we had them read a bunch of traditional Plato, Descartes, all that stuff where it's melt your brain and now think about it. And the paper assignment was discuss how what we read in class has caused you to relook at how you look at the world, or adjust your faith structure, your belief structure. And even if it didn't change, we wanted them to go through that process of thinking about it. And I had those few students like use online websites that were very obviously Christian biased. And they were using that as evidence for them not changing their mind. And as part of their grading structure, like I just pointed it out and like wrote on the paper, was like, these are biased sources. Like they're confirming your beliefs. Like you need to produce unbiased sources. So even calling that out and just pointing it out and being like, this is wrong. Like this is biased. Like if you're going to use it, you need to address it.
So what you're kind of suggesting is more of a change in curriculum almost, and how students are taught throughout their entire lives, because I mean, I didn't have any training in how to read a scientific paper until I was in college. I mean, we knew Wikipedia was a bad thing. I had the same exact thing as Devra. And, you know, I'm going to say one thing. Wikipedia is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, now it's not.
Yeah, it's always a good starting source at this point. Mm-hmm. Like, I will take it. I will say Wikipedia has come a long way.
It has, and they definitely have like a lot of sources at the bottom that you can do that lateral reading and like use those sources. So a lot of Wikipedia sources now do cite scientific or pseudoscientific papers, and then you can go from there.
Yeah, and you can see it all at the bottom, so it's all on the same page. So if I'm saying like websites that have done it partially right at this point, Wikipedia presents the information. They have all of it linked, and they have all of their sources at the end of the page. So,
and
good on you, Wikipedia.
I know for a fact that Wikipedia does, if I remember correctly, they don't allow first-person editorials on stuff. It has to be verified through something.
Yeah, they have a verification process. Like, it's not just one person, like, making an account and changing things. Like, it is actually very structured. I think a lot of people don't understand. But yeah, like in middle school and into high school even, like a lot of the papers that I did, I was using like books as my secondary sources or my primary sources. Like it sound like I did that. I've done that in college.
I used to go to the library.
Yeah, right. I like had like a stack full of books, like
or use the bibliography index cards.
Yeah, and
find what you need.
That's how I got taught how to read things for like a literature review or a research style paper in school, was like going through the books and like having note cards and like writing down like what page number this sentence was on, and like I'm going to use this, sentence was on this, so it was easier to cite later. But just even that skill of being able to read through sources and read through material and pull out what you need and what's important to you and apply it to your own paper, like that's still very valid for internet, online papers, online books now. So that skill's not discounted. But yeah, like there was barely any online primary sources that I used. I remember like my high school had like a subscription to JSTOR, and that was like mind-blowing to use like the JSTOR database to find papers or to find books that like the library didn't have.
Yeah, because the school I was brought up in, we would literally go to the index, find the book, find the page, like you said, write it down. And then we were taught to do it on index cards.
Yep,
so you would have a full, like, starter deck of index cards.
Yep.
But now,
save them and trade them.
But now we have resources like, not Grammarly. What am I thinking of?
I don't know.
Oh, God, I have it on here. Hold on.
Like a bibliography reference tool? Or
reference managers?
Mendeley
Mendeley
is what I'm thinking of. Because then you can actually compile them, you can have them ready to go. A lot of websites now offer their citations, but I
remember when EasyBib was like groundbreaking to use.
Oh, it's so much nicer now. But I think that's also something that our generation can kind of have a unique perspective to offer, because later generations now are so ingrained with instant access and instant gratification, the accessibility. The older generation doesn't quite grasp the transition sometimes. We're that, I've heard it used in other podcasts and essays as basically a digital immigrant, where basically we came from the era of the library visits
offline,
of the book.
Like we're literally like lurking in the back sections of a library, and now we can use digital access, but that also offers us an ability to see that perspective. I think having something like a almost like what the libraries used to have in terms of the standards of what's an authoritative book, what's not, having at least a basic one that teachers can then integrate, because that's a big thing, I think, is this standard would need to be integrated from your very first, whether it's science or English or any kind of class, that standard needs to be taught just as much as, what if you're a history class, as much as it is teaching what the American Revolution is and going through there, being able to then go and cite sources and being able to discern what is and isn't an authoritative source, because that now is shifting because of everyone can have a channel, everyone can have a blog. It's hard to pin things down because we're still trying to apply an older model to a newer format.
I think you said like one of the problems is there's so much content. So like when we were looking up stuff, like we limited what the library had, and it was probably a lot, like either the school library or the city's library, and like maybe there was some online stuff that we used to supplement that, but it was basically the books. And now it's like you type in a search phrase on Google or Google Scholar, and there's millions of results, right? And so it's even learning that skill of like patience and sorting through it. It's like there's so much out there that there's no feasible way of identifying every website, like you said, every blog, every podcast. Like there's too much out there, but providing the tools that allow students or adults the ability to do that themselves, I think, is more crucial than providing like examples are good because you can use them, but like there's never going to be a list of authoritative sources on the internet. Like there's just too many.
It's more like your idea of the flow chart is kind of something I use in my upper level classes, because I try to teach them how to read scientific papers properly, because it's a daunting task. So I break it down, and one of the first things I tell them is to look up the authors. And I mean, we're reading scientific papers, so they already know it's a primary source. But it works the same way. You should look up the authors, see what they do, get to know that person, because they're the one writing that paper. You want to be trusting who's giving you that information.
Yeah, I do that a lot when I read things like Wall Street Journal or The Economist or The Hill. The Hill's a big one I have personal gripes with in terms of how they put their Facebook and Twitter content out. Is they'll use the headline to catch your attention, and then under it they'll be like, opinion. And you already catch like Biden administration going down in flames. Opinion from a right-leaning, but most people don't even bother to read that article. They just see that screen grab and they share it with all their friends on Facebook.
Was it
and
the
clickbait?
Was it the Wall Street Journal that had the whole like that really outdated misogynistic opinion writer that wrote about Jill Biden? Was that the Wall Street Journal? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm pretty sure that was
I don't.
the Wall-
I believe it was the Wall Street.
Because
It was either that or The
it
Economist.
was an opinion piece about like how she's not a real teacher or not a real PhD or
real
something,
doctor,
like she's not a real
because
doctor.
she didn't do medical.
Yeah, because she's not a medical doctor. I'm not a medical doctor either.
Yeah, because it became this whole thing on Twitter about like everyone who has a research PhD saying that they have a doctorate. Like,
but that also becomes something that ties into this with who do you trust is. When I've seen certain things, there was a person I followed or was friends with back home on social media who posted a whole thing about 30,000 doctors signed this petition saying that climate change is not occurring. But then when you look at some of the doctors, you literally just, they have their names, so it's not like I'm doxing them. If I just picked one and threw it into Google to find them, you'd find out one was a podiatrist and one was an orthodontist and the other was, they had a PhD in not chemistry even, it was like classical music or stuff, where it wasn't even pertinent to what they're discussing, but because they had the doctor in front of their name, a lot of people didn't even bother to dive into it and just go, oh, they all say it's fake. Clearly this is a confirmation of my bias and my ideology, and off we go. And that's kind of what the social media thing I think has kind of unfortunately turned into, is these, I don't want to say tribalism, but these echo chamber feedbacks of just purely your ideology at this point. And because of how caustic the last few years, especially in American society, political things have become, it's almost become a quote-unquote safe space. Like, I can sit here and just be told I'm right. No one has to challenge my worldview. I'm good. which I think that's another thing that kids should be taught and be comfortable with, is the challenging of their worldview. Kind of like what you were saying with your text and critics class. I think that is an integral part for especially scientific literacy, is reestablishing that, one, scientists aren't infallible. We're not the Pope. we actually, it's okay when scientists say, I don't know. When scientists speak with such affirmative confidence on every single subject, that makes me naturally uncomfortable. Because then I'm like, are you actually sure, or are you just scared of either not hearing someone go, haha, I was right, you were wrong, I win, or basically worried about being thought of as not credible anymore because you don't know everything.
Yeah, in that same class, it was right when Bill and I did the debate with the Creationist Museum. Ken Ham, yeah. And so we watched part of the debate, and it was obviously like some people were very much more creationist in the class, as I already said, but it was something that I wanted to bring up, and I did bring up that during the debate, Bill and I said that, like, if there is evidence that goes against what the scientific thought is at the time, and it's shown to be valid, like, he'll change his mind on what he believes and what he holds to be true scientifically if there is valid, repeatable evidence that suggests that there could be a substantial change in the way we think about things. And when the moderator asked Ken Ham the same question, like, is there anything that would change your opinion? He just flat out said, like, no, there's nothing that can change my opinion. Like, I know I'm right. And it's like, even like that, like 2 minutes clip of the debate, I think encapsulates the entire divide between scientists and especially evangelicals, but more religious, or even at this point just this kind of tribalist mentality of, I know, like, these talking points that the politicization, it's like one side, if there's enough evidence, will change its mind. Like, that is what the scientific method is. Like, it's the evolution and the adaptation and the growth of what we know about the world based off of the continual build of knowledge of what we find. So things are going to change against this stagnant, like, we know we're right and nothing will ever change our mind about it.
Well, I just have to say, you keep bringing up the religion thought, and the reason for that is being their entire thought process, nothing wrong with it, is based on faith. And faith is based on belief that you just know, and you have to believe in that, and that is your whole identity almost. That's just what you've grown up with, what you know, and it's your future, because that's the afterlife as well. So it's hard to break that kind of thought, and for me, part of this religion side of things, whether you're scientific or not, it's so polarizing, because there are certain scientists that are like, you can't intertwine science with religion, but we have to stop that thought process.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You can definitely intertwine science with religion.
Well, one of the members
They
who
are not
mapped the
mutually
human
exclusive.
genome is
Exactly.
a devout Catholic.
Very Catholic
you are
and religious.
perfectly capable of being spiritual, religious, of all sorts, and still being able to do the scientific method, because the scientific method is not based on faith. It is based on factual evidence. And it's also even better because you're getting to know the world that your God or whatever religion you're part of created.
Right.
So it's really just
I don't
partially...
I don't have any issues with religion in general. It's just there's, especially in America, a very particular group of religious people who have been very anti-science since about the 80s.
Yeah.
They've been very, very anti-science, and I think that's something that has led to the decline of scientific literacy in the States, is because their sphere of influence has gotten so large that they've been able to level and increase their religious beliefs, whether, it's their religious beliefs on how the world was made. They've been able to elevate that to the same level as scientific theory and scientific law. And when you do that, I think there is an inevitable confusion of the general populace, especially when you do it at schools, and you do it in schools, and then those students grow up to be adults who now have this conflated sense of one is equal to the other, where I think that just has led into this lack of scientific literacy. And I do think scientific literacy builds into digital literacy, because if you're able to think critically about science, then you should be able to think critically about what you see on the internet. It's the same skills being applied.
Now, with that, do you, and we've talked about this stuff in the past, off this podcast, but in terms of meeting people halfway, there's different schools of thought, and we all kind of fall on a spectrum of it, but you have, like, the Richard Dawkins, and those ones who are almost, I feel, unfortunately, have become dogmatic.
Yeah,
absolutely.
In
they're their
how
own religion.
Science has become a religion for them. Yeah.
Right, the hypocrisy in that, where they almost do the exact same thing evangelicals or other types of ideologies have kind of, if it's not X, I don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
I feel like that is a hindrance, because I often hear that used against us, is like, or the stereotype that, going off of what Melina was saying, like, you can be scientific and religious, is everyone thinks everyone is this Richard Dawkins, dry, snide, atheistic, this is the world through this lens, and that's it. You can't really talk to me if you're religious and you're not willing to accept all of my items. Do you both believe that there's a way for, whether on digital communication or from an educational perspective, you can talk to people without having these aggressive ideological conflicts?
I mean, I've been relatively successful with that. You just have to respect each other's opinions. I mean, if somebody is coming at you and being completely rude to you, you exit the conversation. You say, okay, this is not productive. This is not working out. I would like to revisit this at some other time. But you can't come at each other already angry. And that's the problem with Richard Dawkins and people that do have that sort of mindset. You're just as closed-minded as somebody on the other side of you. You have to both be open to meeting halfway. And you can tell immediately when somebody's not going to be open about it. And if you're just going to be arguing your head off for hours and hours if you want to, and it's not going to make any headway. So for your own sanity and probably for your relationship with that person, you should back off, but it has to be a respectful conversation. And we were just talking about this earlier, approaching from a standpoint of what they think is important as well. You need to take a step back and be like, okay, this side might not be what's important to me, but this is how I'm going to connect with this person on a different level. You have to find some sort of common ground or figure it out. You just got to figure it out. And I'm not a fan of Richard Dawkins, so I will say he should just shut his mouth.
I definitely think meeting people halfway is the way to go about it. No one's going to change their mindset overnight. So it's about providing them enough information and really getting to know where they're coming from, or attempting to, so that you provide them with the right information that they can access and build into their framework, their mental framework at that point, and not have such cognitive dissonance going on. So a couple of examples like that. When I was a TA at Text and Critics, when we did hit like evolution, like we had them read chapters of Origin of the Species and all of that stuff, and it became a way to have a fruitful lecture with these 18-year-old freshmen without it turning into bickering or arguments back and forth between different viewpoints and ideologies. And there is a way, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of scientists that don't agree with doing this, but one way that I found works is kind of providing them to place, especially evolution, in their framework of religion. And so something that worked with at least one of the students was basically like, okay, like, sure, your God created the universe, and he created the Big Bang, because the Big Bang is something that's very hard for people to wrap their heads around it's something that's so like theoretical that it's just like
Yeah.
whatever.
I still don't get the Big Bang. It's the Big Bang. It happened.
It happened. Two atoms magically
I'm like, cool,
combined
we're
together
here now.
and it created the universe, right? Like it sounds magical.
According to DC Comics, it's one giant celestial hand that just spewed it out.
So like that is something that is, yes, very hard for people to get. And so I don't see anything wrong with allowing them to place that in their own framework and basically saying like, okay, your God created the universe. He caused the Big Bang. Everything after that is indirectly their doing because they started the universe. That allows them to study science, study evolution under that framework of, like you said earlier, like they're studying their God's work or the world their God created in some form or fashion. So I think allowing them to place it in their framework goes a long way in getting them to accept certain facts. And that's something that I've read and not personally worked with, but talked about in museums as well, is that in museums you have people coming in with all sorts of inherent biases, inherent thought processes. You don't know what sort of connections and prior knowledge that they have coming in, but your job is to present whatever scientific facts you're presenting in your museum in a way that they can hopefully add that onto their mental framework and slowly work it in so that it's not negative towards them and it's not impossible for them. So like, and it might take multiple trips and multiple visits, but it's allowing them to place that scientific knowledge in their own framework and whatever like mental massaging they have to do with it to make it fit, like ultimately that's on them. But allowing them to do that and giving them the freedom of placing it in their own framework and letting them grow with it.
I just had this. It's not the same side of things, but I'm teaching mineralogy this semester, and I've also been having them do these blog posts. And when people think of minerals, a lot of times people think of crystals, and crystals are typically used for many different spiritual purposes. I personally think it's fascinating, all of the different ways that people think or would want to use crystals. But I've had a few students talk about their mystical properties. And for me, I don't see a problem with that. There are unknown factors. Okay, go ahead and believe what you want to believe. But fit it into the framework of what we know. Why do those mystical properties actually happen if that's the case? What does the science tell us? Okay, perhaps this mineral or this crystal means protection because it formed in a certain way and it's very, very hard because of the way it formed. So you can teach these things in multiple different ways that can fit into these different belief systems, these different interests, that makes it a connection to science that's more fun, more personal, more relatable, as opposed to me just going, well, this mineral is fluorite, calcium fluoride, CAF, let's do this, let's do that. It's all much more fun. Make it a little bit fun.
Yeah, and the minute you shut somebody down and stop that process from happening and tell them that they're wrong and that their belief system is wrong and that it's not scientifically possible, like, you've lost them forever. Like, they're never going to listen to science again. They might pass your class for the sake of passing your class, but
they're done.
Going forward, they're done. They're never going to want to engage with science again because, like, no one likes being told that they're wrong. And if you come at it in, like, the Richard Dawkins-esque way of, like, this is right, you're wrong, they're never going to want to engage with any science ever again.
Well, like, in terms of, like, the Dawkins-esque, not nearly as bad. Someone who I actually do appreciate a lot of what he does, in Neil deGrasse Tyson. I remember back before I got rid of listening to Joe Rogan because he has unfortunately become a peddler of pseudoscience and anti-science statements. When he had Neil deGrasse Tyson on a couple years ago, Neil said something that stuck out to me, which was, if I can't convince you in about 120 to 90 seconds, I disengage from you. And I Well, I understand that in the sense of, like what we've said, if someone comes to the table and you can tell they don't want to talk, they want to be reaffirmed that their belief is correct and you're wrong, I get that. But in the terms of those who are legitimately reaching out with a question and they have a different worldview and you shut them down immediately because of that, you have now, like you said, you've cut them off completely. They may come back to science. They may come to a different scientist or, okay, we're not going to talk to a geologist anymore, but I'll talk to a chemist now, and their methodology may get to them. But when they're not willing to engage, it's a different element. But we're all trying to learn and survive on this floating mud ball in space. Nothing's definitive. Science itself is one of the best examples of science. Or of the world. It's it's a living, breathing thing. 100 years ago, we're all paleontologists at this table. 100 years ago, people thought that they dragged their tails. Yeah. They were cold-blooded. The iguanodon looked like a giant lizard with a nose spike. But and as we've gone through it, now they have feathers. They have now they just don't have feathers. They have filaments. They have fur. They're endothermic. There's elements to them that are, if I took it to, one of the Bone Wars paleontologists and was like, this is what you're digging up, they would go, no, you weird psycho future man, go back to where you came from in your purple hair. But I don't know, it's one of those things where it's interesting to see how things have shifted, especially in science. That's a big point we want to teach people. And I believe when we were talking about the scientific method, Devra, I believe you've mentioned it before. One of the failings, I feel like, of the education system, and not a condemnation of it, but something that we should embrace and kind of try to grow to change, is when everyone hears the scientific method, whether they're 6 or 60, they just list out the 8 steps, and that's science. That's how science works. And we all have done research in some form or fashion, and that's not how actual scientific discovery occurs. You don't just sit there and you go up to a grant committee and go, I have my 8 steps, and they go, here's the money. You understand that things change, data points move, and you try to understand why things are changing. And I'm not saying we teach 3rd graders the complexities of research, but I do think that as science goes up in education levels, I think we should start teaching that there's a more fluidity to it.
Yeah, you have to talk about it's non-linear. It's not the linear process that everybody's taught. Sure, there's a question, there's a hypothesis. Those really are the starting points. But then there's another question and another hypothesis almost immediately, and then that one fails, and then you have to start again. And then that one fails, and then you have to start again, and then it works, and then later on you realize, oh no, I messed up. and then you've redone the same thing over and over again, and it's repetition. And then even if you are right and you discover something very exciting, that spurs a whole bunch of other different questions and things that you don't know. It's all so exciting. It's not just this 1, 2, 3 boring step process. It's exploring this whole new world that other people haven't really gotten to explore yet. And if other people have, it's your first time. So it's fun all the same.
Something that I thought while you were kind of talking about the Neil deGrasse Tyson thing is with the prevalence of social media, I think it's very different how scientists interact with the public now, because it's not the general public coming to us as scientists looking for answers or as a talk or something like that.
We've shifted
we
from
are
reactive.
We are actively reaching out to them and kind of just shouting into the void and hope people listen to us. So I think the way it really is a lot more figuring out how to present it and allowing them to meet us halfway, because it still happens. Like, there are still talks and there are still museums and all that, so there still exists the general public coming to the science, but more and more it's more prevalent now that it's the science reaching out to the general public. And I think that drastically changes how we view science communication. That's something that a lot of scientists don't want to admit, because they want to keep that position of authority and power in the dynamic. And it's something that younger scientists are embracing much more than older scientists.
Well, that's part of breaking the barrier, is stop seeing scientists as we're sitting in our high castle looking down on everybody like we know more than you because we've done all this research. I am just a regular person. Zach and Devra are just regular people. We all have other hobbies. We all have other things that we're interested in. We are people that were interested in a subject almost obsessively and decided that we wanted to study it. We're not any different than anybody else. And there are still so many people that see scientists, as we were talking about earlier, as just like these people that are almost untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
And man, I'm so infallible. I don't know so many things, and just because I'm a doctor doesn't mean I know everything. And people still see doctors, just that title, whatever doctor you are, as you know it all.
Mm-hmm.
And no. I do not know it all.
If you know what a scientific doctorate means, it means you only know things about a very, very, very specific field. Yeah.
And you also know all of the things that you don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that's that feeds into both a positive and negative that the internet has created over the last several years, which is this democratization of information. It's leveled the playing field that everyone can have a voice, but also has caused a problem that everyone has a voice.
Yep.
And it's, I think, another step in education, especially when it comes to digital literacy and that who do you trust, is we have to kind of restructure how the authoritative figures can still stand up and have a little more weight than like a Joe Rogan or certain people who, God bless them, they probably really do want to learn, but the problem becomes, well, he has a larger audience. Okay, that's great, but he doesn't have the expertise. Like and this is something that ties in with another part of my paper where I went into pseudoscience and anti-science, was at the start of like the pandemic, I was really actually proud of Joe Rogan because he brought on different immunologists, virologists, people from different infectious disease institutes to actually give breakdowns. But then because of the constant need for content creation, and maybe it's because of people he runs in circles with and his predisposition to conspiracies, he brought on a lot of people who started turning it toxic. And then it slowly shifted into his worldview kept getting attacked by other organizations and institutes. And so in response, he kept building up more of these people who reaffirmed what he was saying. And that's eventually how we got to the ivermectin incident, which, whether or not you side on that or not, what ended up happening was, even if he was provided ivermectin by an actual doctor, whether doctors agree or not with what he did, the problem became people were then going out and getting any form of it, henceforth why the center, or was it the poison hotline, or was getting rapid calls of, I've swallowed things I shouldn't.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, doctors are trying to tell them on national media, like, don't do this. But on social media, Moms for Babies 32 of West Newbury posted a Facebook article, and suddenly they retweeted it, they shared it, and it just spread. And by the time the science community reacted, the damage had already been done. And I'm wondering if establishing how we kind of discern someone who's popular from someone who's an expert, again, because it's, while not saying that everyone can't have opinions or voice their concerns or question.
Everybody can have opinions. But
a person who is specialized in a field should be looked at more for their expertise, because they've studied it. They know the ins and outs. They know the intricacies that most common people don't know.
The thing is, there's a difference between opinions, I think, and spreading misinformation. You can have an opinion like, oh, I think that maybe I don't want to get the vaccine or something. That's an opinion. But spreading around some other form of medication to take that's not, recommended by actual medical doctors, that for me is not an opinion anymore, that's almost a vicious attack on
Yeah.
everybody else.
Or spreading the spreading the rumors of the vaccine causes these side effects, like based off of anecdotal evidence passed down through reshare after reshare after reshare. Like to that at that point, that's something else that should be taught. And I think very recently Facebook did do a somewhat good thing about posting a disclaimer when people started sharing stuff about medical things, and specifically COVID, was there's a disclaimer about like this post may contain information about this, like, and it was very reactionary. It was very late to the party, but it was an effort to kind of teach people in real time, hey, this might not be true. Or like, I know Facebook has like live fact checking now that like if you click on an article or go to reshare it, like it pops like suggested articles underneath it and like shows either like this has been proven false or this has been proven true. Like it's better. And Twitter now,
Twitter has something like
Twitter
that
has something too. Like if you reshare something, if you retweet something without clicking into, especially articles, without clicking into the article, it actually pops up a button that it's like, it doesn't seem like you've read this page, like you've read the link, do you still want to share it? Like, so there are efforts now on social media to limit the rapidness and just flagrant blatant people they don't know what they're reading. They're seeing the headline, they're seeing the clickbait and just resharing it and not reading the article.
Because, yes, that's what I believe.
Right. And so
because it gets a reaction.
Yeah.
And so like you get enough people sharing it, it becomes this like internet myth rumor that people think is true. So there are efforts to kind of teach this digital scientific literacy on the fly by these social media outlets, but I do think it came a bit too late.
Yeah.
It was much more reactionary to whatever that event was. And by the time they reacted to it, everyone had kind of moved on to the next.
And it was kind of like also Facebook's attempt to like save their own asses about misinformation being spread on their platform more than it seemed like an actual effort to teach people what a good source was.
And I think that does go back to the idea of this needs to be ingrained early on.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Because it's great that the social media networks do this, but they do it not for the altruistic reasons. They do it for a financial protection. It's similar to why television networks, they won't let certain people on, or used to, was because advertisers wouldn't want that content tied to, or that rant tied to their brand of tissue paper. Oh, well, that guy spouted misinformation about a virus. Buy Kleenex. And they don't want that. But I think that if we, at least from an educational perspective, start teaching these as ingrained elements instead of a, let me finish my one thought. I did my train jumping. If we teach it as like an ingrained element instead of it being like a selective like class, because I've taken classes where in the moment I love everything I've learned, but because I'm not actively reusing it, it gets dumped.
It goes away.
But like if it's a constant element, and not just an element in science, but an element in the history classes, an element in, if you're going into, sex education or just medical anatomy classes, physics, chemistry, like if these classes ingrain these into it, I feel like that is a great way to curb this problem of this catchy headline caught me, and then as I read it, they're saying things that resonate with me. I'm not going to disagree, because once it gets you, it's harder for you to break them of that hook. That's a big thing that anti-science and pseudoscience people implemented, and I have it in my paper, that they have almost like a playbook of this mainly came from originally the anti-vax movement, but it's been adopted by the flat earthers and other, young earth creationists. They find elements to attack, or attack is a bad way for me to describe it, but in my mind it is an attack. is they find a weak point on that person and they exploit it. For anti-vax, it was in the 80s, mothers getting concerned that the harmful elements were being injected into their children. There were, occasional cases reported of kids having adverse side effects to, I believe, I want to say the MMR vaccine. I would have to go back and look at my notes, but in doing that, the scientists, the doctors at the time, unfortunately took the traditional stance of, I'm a medical expert, I have the white coat, you listen to me. And they demeaned her or demeaned the mothers and talked down to them. The anti-vax groups kind of came in and went, that's not how they're supposed to talk to you. You're the mother. It's your concern. It's your child. And she's like, yeah, that is what I'm supposed to do. And they're like, and also, it causes autism. It also causes deformities. It causes... And, science debunked all those claims, but they've already caught you with that raw emotional point, and now that's been absorbed into your worldview is, oh, they get me, unlike the mean stoic doctor. And I think that's been a major problem. And one of the things I in a different paper, I cited that the advent of talk TV became a very detrimental element to this, because instead of having a scientist who could maybe be standoffish and cold, but still provide the evidence to address their concerns, but maybe their bedside manner was not the top tier, they unfortunately wanted that conflict instead. And that almost stoked the embers of the other side. And because of that conflict, other programs brought on a scientist and the anti-vaxxer and the crying mother in the middle. And they kept doing it because, well, people watched. Well, that got a message out that now has carried since the 80s, and anti-vax rhetoric has existed since vaccines. I mean, there's cartoons back in the day of the smallpox vaccine. They said that if you take it, you'll sprout cow legs and you'll turn into a cow because it was derived from bovine.
Give me cows.
It's like literally you just turn into cows. It's absurd when you think about it, but it fostered that fear of the unknown. And I feel like that's what anti-science has done a really good job of kind of doing online, which is get that inflammatory post that catches your attention, or, just touches that back of your brain of, I don't trust this, or I don't like this. And now they're indoctrinated, basically. And I feel like that's a good way, that's an element we really need to combat, especially with if we do this stagnant or staggered progression.
Scaffolding.
Yes, it helps kind of prevent that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's in the education system, but it's also in other places as well. Like the ability to teach how to think critically and kind of challenge what you see, not in a malicious way, but like there are so many museum exhibits that are sponsored by companies, and it's like not that they're 100% influencing the content that's going in, but it's still a valid thing to like look at, like, why is ExxonMobil sponsoring an energy exhibit at the Houston Science Center? Like it's all very good stuff that's in there, and none of it seemed wrong when we walked through it, but it's still like taking a step back. And you can take corporate sponsorships, but still like being a bit more visible with who's sponsoring stuff and like what that might mean, and almost making it part of the exhibit. I think museums could still do a bit more with pointing out internal biases that's created by sponsorships or by who's running the museum or something like that. Like there's always ways of pointing out biases and allowing the public to learn how to do that on their own. Like it doesn't have to become a negative thing. Like it can just become like part of the exhibit. Like, for more paleontological stuff, like there's a prevalence of white males being shown in paleo exhibits because that's the dominant story. But there are plenty of opportunities that museums can combat that and show other people of different backgrounds, different minorities, doing science of any sort throughout history. And it doesn't have to be a dig on what the museum previously did. It's all about that learning and that growth and just teaching people, even like indirectly and subtly, like, this is what bias looks like.
Mm-hmm. And museums have at least taken a progressive step forward in showing the impact or how their exhibits tie into real world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I remember as a kid, they just kind of showed you dinosaurs,
Right.
or they showed you ancient indigenous peoples' items or their clothes.
It was still very stagnant. Like, you were there to learn, and here were the objects presented, and you were taking in the information.
And read these things.
Yeah, exactly.
These very, very long plaques.
Yeah.
And now a lot of places like the Houston Natural History Museum has a lot of interactive digital components. A couple other museums, the Field Museum has started implementing that. I'm sure AMNH and the Smithsonian, they've implemented more interactive because that engagement. And I think that's a big thing in terms of getting museums as well as, teaching and educational institutes, is that more proactive, specialized engagement instead of just a blanket binary education packet. Because when you do that, the problem becomes different people have different learning capabilities. One big issue I've always heard from friends who are full-on teachers is you can't speed up for the more advanced ones, but you can't slow down for the ones who are struggling.
You always have to teach the lowest common denominator, and it's something that I actually was introduced more in dance classes than actual school, just because I was lucky enough to go to a more academically challenged school, so there wasn't really a lot. There's like multiple tiers that you could take, so there wasn't really like a lot of people in one class that the teacher had to split attention for. But it's something that I actually, I'm more experienced in my dance classes, where it's like, oh, but like I know how to do this already, like why can't we go forward? It's like, but we have to make sure everybody knows how to do it before you go, it's the letting the common denominator set the pace, and it can be frustrating, but it's something that does need to happen, because like it's not fair to them to be dropped out just because they might learn slower at a different style or something like that.
But with different levels of engagement, that really ties into with teaching the active learning push and being able to, yes, you still do have to teach to like the common denominator, the lowest possible thing, or within the middle, but you can provide them with their own opportunities to do some sort of worksheet on real data and discover things, and then at that point, maybe you make it an intermediate level. And if they're doing this worksheet on their own, or they're doing this activity on their own, you can give those other students the attention that they need, and the students that are more gifted should get it on their own.
Yeah.
So this whole engaging students, experiential learning is something that's being pushed.
And that's something that's been in museums too. Yeah.
And it puts you right in the thick of things, and you're learning it all for yourself, and that's also something that's going to help with science literacy, because you're doing it yourself and you're not having somebody tell you it. You're experiencing the process. You're experiencing some sort of science, whether it's going out, and I know people at UNO are doing atmospheric balloons into the atmosphere to look at certain things in the clouds, particularly bacteria, in certain cases microbes. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can involve students of different levels with different engagement strategies.
Yeah, and I've noticed, at least on certain social media platforms, we were talking about it earlier, that there's been people who like to teach geology have been utilizing Minecraft. People can then go in and game and do it themselves and actually interact with those, same elements, or kind of see it themselves, or build their own thing. I feel like that's an untapped potential. I mean,
yeah, I taught the same virtual paleo class. We used a program called GatherTown that essentially you can build these maps that have different layers, and it's kind of like old school Pokemon or Zelda or whatever. It's very 8-bit, one level that you have to make your way around, but we created a model of an entire stratigraphic basin for the Permian, and let the kids like just go loose. And it's like, your job is to create a stratigraphic column. And I had done exercises before on how to do that using smaller data, and I could have given them double the amount of time, and I think they would have still been happy. Like, they were just like happy to play around this sandbox, like trying to find all the Easter eggs that the camp director had put in there with all the different fossils, and they had to find the information that gave them the information for the rock layers and match that across different areas of the map. And yeah, it was just like, they were completely thrilled to be doing that, and it got them looking for stuff, it got them engaged, and that was the best exercise to even the playing field, because I did have some students that learned at a much slower rate than the rest of them, and that was something that allowed them all to take it at their own pace and go in and do whatever they wanted with it at their own pace, and they still all got the same end result out of it.
Yeah, it's that is the next, I think, step for learning, as well as things like museum outreach and everything, is how to utilize social media as a more active tool and not a passive tool of just, oh, we have a gala opening. But I think COVID, one of the benefits that it provided was it forced something that probably I think would have taken another decade or so for a lot of people to come to that conclusion. It forced people in a very short succession to realize, oh, we need to adapt our presentation formatting. Like the camps that you've taught, you told me that they're kind of acknowledging that remote experiences now are going to be kind of integrated into the...
Yeah, they're always going to have virtual camps, and I'm sure there are some people who would prefer to do it in person. And obviously you can't do field camps virtually, but the content-based ones that, yeah, like absolutely, they're always going to have virtual camps, because it also widened the amount of people that they can have do it. They widened the amount of people that can log in and take them, because otherwise, like, everyone would have had to travel down to the museum and take them in person, and like that's just not feasible for a lot of people. But the cost of taking the camp virtually is less than taking the camp in person, because that travel's not there, and that opens up that accessibility to a lot of people.
I guess the last thing I would ask about all of this is, do you think that we've kind of talked about the educator's side and kind of the outreach and education components. For any of this, do you think that there is a necessity for any governmental intervention or stepping in? Like in terms of who do you trust? There was the fairness doctrine back in the day that forced news networks to actually present both sides in a uncombative way. They just presented, here's the positions on this fiscal decision. This is the right's decision and why. This is the left's decision and why. And the newscasters may or may not have interacted or injected a little bit of their own opinion, but generally they presented the two elements and allowed the audience to kind of see which one made the better case. Because that no longer exists, that's why we have the hyper-partisan networks of Fox, Newsmax, OAN, and then on the other side you have MSNBC and CNN, who they have their diametrically opposed audiences, and there's no middle. Do you think on social media there needs to be kind of almost a modernization of the fairness doctrine to kind of counterbalance? Because I know certain social networks try it, but then that kind of feeds in conspiracies and, you're trying to repress this talk.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope, I think, because a lot of people would see that as an attack on their freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It's government intervention in something that is their personal space, or what most people consider to be their personal space. Whenever there's any sort of talk about regulation of the internet, people get very upset because that's their access to information. It's their way that they're communicating. So although I might personally, because I want information to be shared equally, say, oh yes, that'd be great if there was some sort of regulation of the internet, that might also influence my access to information. There might be some, pathways that I don't necessarily think about right now that I could be impacted by. by that happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the best way is ultimately through education, which is a long process because you have to give it to the kids when they're in school, and like it's a very delayed action. It needs to be done in a way that doesn't make it seem lagged or outdated. But I think having something similar to the national science standards or either built into national science standards, like I feel like there could be a national digital standard that like there's tools and there's skills that students need to learn to be able to function at a successful level on the internet, and that is then required to be built into education programs and curriculums like the national science standard. I think that would be the way to go with government regulation.
I think this might be a bad comparison, but I'm going to compare it to just literacy in general. And the internet is still a very, very, very new thing.
Mm-hmm.
And most people are still just learning how to actually maneuver it. It's a very powerful tool, and it's almost comparable to reading and being capable of reading. And in the past, there was a huge amount of people that were not capable of actually reading. So getting that information from other sources was what they would do, or word of mouth. And here, it's almost like we're in a similar instance.
Mm-hmm.
Now almost everybody, at least in the United States, probably can read, but you might not be able to figure out the internet yet or how to actually use it.
Yeah, because the only other thing I could think of, and we talked about it on our way over here, was the reaction to Sputnik. Was basically there was an education standard and an education act that got pushed through by the United States government as kind of a reaction to Sputnik going to space, was to make sure that everyone was scientifically educated. They knew what science was. They knew what the space race was basically becoming. I don't think that it needs... Unfortunately, it was geopolitically motivated. It was communism versus capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
But taking that aside, I feel like we need a big push, both internally and externally from like our, unfortunately from the government, like almost a rally. Like everyone becomes digitally literate, and then it gives the empowerment to the educators, to the institutions to format that. Because right now everyone feels kind of dispersed in their own little cells and units trying to help, but depending on your state, sometimes your education-based, institution or your Department of Education may not be receiving the support or backing that it really does need.
And going off what you just said, Melina, like we have teachers that probably don't know how to use the internet well themselves. So, they themselves don't know how to distinguish authoritative sources or determine biases or actually find primary sources on the internet and find out what they are. Like, just because there's this big stretch of a wide range of demographics of teachers, that there are definitely teachers that don't know how to use the internet, and they're trying to teach either on the internet itself with COVID and virtual, or they're trying to teach how to use the internet and use it as an education tool. And if you don't know how to use it, how are you expected to successfully teach others how to use it?
Well, this brings up something that was actually being talked about during COVID and with remote teaching. And if internet right now is so important and for education and being able to be digitally literate and find primary sources and understand science, should internet be an inherent right of everybody? Because
it's a utility.
You're talking about students coming to that paleo camp online. There were issues with poor communities, places that don't actually have access to laptops or internet, and they were falling behind because they didn't have that money to actually fund their students, and so some students just weren't capable of doing those things. So at this point, if education is going to take that turn, if the government is going to have some sort of regulation, that's really, in my opinion, the ultimate question of, is internet an inherent right of everybody, and should we all be able to have access to it?
I definitely think it should be treated as a utility. Like, it should be treated as electricity, as water, that there's still problems with accessibility with those utilities. Until there's a huge infrastructure push, there's always going to be areas that are lower economic classes that have issues getting to that, and that is a huge issue. And that's something that the government should be working on fixing and equalizing, but I do think that the internet should be treated as a utility, and doing that would be a big step for getting access to remote and impoverished communities, because it's then treated as something that they need to survive.
So, clarification just on what you mean by utility, because if you're saying utility like water or electricity, I have to pay for that every month. So, is everybody then paying for the internet? Because right now, technically, sure, I have to pay for my electricity, I have to pay for my Wi-Fi, but I could go to a publicly available network and still use it.
But someone's paying for that somebody's paying for that publicly available. Like, we go to Starbucks and use their internet. Starbucks paying for that network at their thing. Like, and I know there are countries that have government Wi-Fi. I think South Korea does that. Like, Wi-Fi is literally free, and you just like log in. I think the problem with trying to implement that in the States is that we are so huge, like, as a landmass. Like, each of our states is the size of a European country.
Perhaps by city.
Yeah. And then it becomes a funding thing, and you get into the problem of local versus federal funding, and I think it becomes a huge thing.
Become taxed.
Yeah, I agree.
And then you run into the issue of, do the urban communities get it faster because they're denser
Because,
populace? Do the rural, because then it becomes similar to the post office.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's still I think, because like you mentioned, like the internet happened relatively so quickly.
Yeah, so fast.
that the infrastructure wasn't there to allow equal access, and I think now we are realizing that like it is really a necessity, and like there were companies doing like those mobile vans last year to get Wi-Fi to people, and I think it is something that is probably needed. I don't know how likely it is that it would happen that there's free Wi-Fi or free internet, but it at least needs to be built into the infrastructure list a bit better.
It's just a question I've thought of a lot recently, because, I mean, if I always say if an apocalypse were to happen and everything were to go to crap, I would miss the internet the most. I would miss my access to information, and I think pretty much at this point we rely so heavily on being so interconnected that if this were to crash at any point in time, it would be detrimental to everyone.
Yeah.
We would not know what to do. So having that as an inherent right or some sort of resource that is available to everybody would be one way to kind of push for that education in digital literacy earlier on. Right now it's still not necessarily, everybody needs this.
Right, it needs to almost become a societal shift in priority, which I feel like in the next couple decades that will probably more than likely come. But
at least something close to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But until it shifts from, this is a nice little convenience, to this is something, like you said, that pretty much at this point, if everyone shut the lights off, most people, I think, would go insane. There would be such a hard, because we all have that innate, we wake up in the morning and, people will check their cell phones and see if they got any new messages.
And in the evening, you go and you watch Netflix or you play video games online.
Even we even like get the like TV via Wi-Fi now. Like,
yeah. All of the streaming services, it's no longer cable. It's
Yeah.
no longer landline connected very often. I mean, people still have cable, you ancients. But
Well, I think that is a great stopping point, is that I want to thank you both for joining me on this. I guess considering that it'll both be for the class and probably I'll upload it to my channel, where can everybody find you or follow you guys for any more outreach or any other cool projects or things you want to talk about?
I am at Paleo, Paleo, gal _ Devra, Devra, on both Twitter and Instagram. So that's where most of my social media presence is.
And I am occasionally active on Twitter as at PhD Goddess, capital P, lowercase h, capital D, _ Goddess. That is it.
And then you can find me on YouTube and as well as Twitter under the Thesaurus, which is always hard for me to say. My tongue gets too big for my own mouth. And then also you can find this probably soon on Anchor and everything else as a part of the Sora podcast. So once again, thank you both for being a part of this, and thank you all for in the class listening to this. Have a good rest of your night, everybody, or day.